Hello, my name is Sara Khatib, and I'm a graduate student in the Department of Anthropology at the University of Oregon. Welcome to my presentation titled Western Cosmology, Scientific Inquiry, and the H.J. Andrews Experimental Forest. In the Western Cascades of Oregon, there is a long-term ecological research site known as the H.J. Andrews Experimental Forest. It is a steep landscape that is covered by old-growth and second-growth forests with Douglas fir, hemlock, and western cedar all draped in moss and lichen. Like veins trickling into the landscape, cold streams bleed throughout the steep hills, circulating sediments and providing nourishment. The site is located on Molalla and the Confederate tribes of Grand Ronde territories. However, it is now occupied by settler colonialists and it is dedicated toward Euro-American forms of scientific inquiry. When the site was initially established in 1948 by the USDA Forest Service, it was to study the conversion of old-growth landscapes into tree plantations. Since then, there are multiple traditions of science that have occurred at the H.J. Andrews Experimental Forest, and these different traditions are based on different cosmological perceptions of forests. In this presentation, I will offer a snapshot of the different regimes of science and the cultural perceptions of forests that underlie them. By understanding how science is situated in culture, I hope to seek ways that we can decenter the knowledge production process. I hope to do this by demonstrating how science is subject to various cultural, political, economic, and cosmological motives, and to combat the illusionment of scientific authority over other forms of knowledge. The four traditions that I outline in this talk are industrial forestry, ecosystem ecology, natural history, and dynamic ecology. Industrial forestry, the first regime of science at the H.J. Andrews, emerged from the post-World War economic boom and its skyrocketing demand for timber. During this time, old-growth forests were dwindling at an unprecedented rate. Rather than a living entity with cyclic patterns, the timbermen perceived the forest as an infinite resource for material progress. As the years on the war came to a close, timber scarcity became an issue and public attention turned towards the national forests. This resulted in the USDA Forest Service's establishment of experimental research sites, such as the H.J. Andrews. The experimental sites were dedicated locations to learn about converting old-growth forests into Douglas fir tree plantations. This demonstrates a transition from the cut-and-run philosophy toward imposing an agricultural model onto forestry. There was a sense of moralism that motivated this regime of science. Timbermen and researchers perceived old-growth forests as wastelands, barren, and full of rot. They believed they were engaged in a moral duty by eradicating so-called undesirable species and optimizing the forest for species that are most profitable in the marketplace. This stage was driven by a close coupling of science and progress that reached back to the Enlightenment, as influential thinkers of the time argued that science was a tool to restore mankind's lost dominion over nature. With science and management, mankind could transform what they saw as unruly and wretched forests into managed landscapes and bring order to nature. This perception of forests as a stockhouse for resources went hand in hand with the post-war housing boom and its skyrocketing demand for timber. By the 1970s, the post-war demand for timber was dwindling as cultural awareness of the environmental crisis was rising. This resulted in the transition away from industrial forestry and toward ecosystem ecology. Ecosystem ecology borrows from general systems theory and applies it to the natural world. Rather than perceiving old-growth forests as barren wastelands, this tradition depicts forests as mechanistic systems with interdependent parts that are connected by causal nexus. This tradition borrows heavily from physics and economic frameworks and perpetuates a materialistic and utilitarian view of forests. It does so by reducing the entirety of a forest to physical and discrete compartments, and the relationships between them are defined in purely economic terms. For instance, ecosystem models describe the exchange and flow of currency throughout the system, and in this context, currency can be nutrients or energy. This tradition parallels a cultural belief that we can better manage environments by understanding the structure and function of ecological systems. However, this regime imposed frameworks from economics and physics onto forests rather than observing what lessons the forests might have for restructuring our own economic systems. This comes from a cultural assumption that the environmental crisis is purely a technical problem rather than a cultural, economic, political, or ideological one. With the perception of forests as machines, scientists become like pseudo engineers seeking to understand how the system functions and finding ways to tweak it and restore it for our own means. This mechanical philosophy of nature also stems back to the Enlightenment, where nature is depicted as a clock and the product of a divine artificer god. Humans are understood to have a unique and divine capability of logic and reason, which gives us the exceptional ability over all other beings to understand these mechanistic systems of nature. This rationalist philosophy assumes that nature is subject to laws and formulas and seeks to develop models that are expected to apply across space and time. During the same time that ecosystem ecology was picking up steam, scientists at the Andrews were also practicing another version of science that is more closely related to natural history. While ecosystem ecology imposes universal models that generalize across all ecosystems, natural history situates itself to one particular place and uses more observational and descriptive methodologies to study the historical interactions between non-human beings and their environment. Philosophically, this tradition resembles Franz Boas's concept of historical particularism because it argues that the current state of a landscape is contingent on historical events that are unique to that particular place. This tradition is also more focused on the species level in the documentation of biological diversity. Natural history stems back further than capitalism and has roots in pre-Christian animism. In this tradition, the forest is perceived to be alive rather than just a mechanistic system. More recently, natural history has taken a secular form, but it has maintained a strong moralistic thread to promote fellowship between humans and the more than human community. At the H.J. Andrews, this tradition continues, although current funding prioritizes more quantitative and experimental modes of research. The rising awareness of climate change, raging fires, and political upheaval parallel the emergence of a more recent tradition at the H.J. Andrews, dynamic ecology. In this tradition, forests are no longer seen as bounded and closed systems, but rather as open-ended and even chaotic. Scientists strive to develop models to predict how forests will respond to various forms of disturbances. This field parallels a cultural and philosophical grappling with uncertainty in response to the climate crisis. It contrasts with previous traditions that portray nature as orderly and perfectly programmed, and this emerging realization of indeterminacy in nature has led some scientists to express a great sense of humility. Although the philosophy and perception of forests are changing, The tools that are used to understand them stem from previous traditions of science, which imposes limitations. Historically, there's been an assumption that science is our only means toward objective knowledge, that is, knowledge that is unbiased, representative of reality, and not tainted by our subjective experiences. However, by looking into the history of the site, we can see that science does not stand unscathed, untouched, a discrete component floating outside of our social worlds, but rather science is messily entangled with various subjectivities, histories, and agendas that are driven by institutions and individuals. The subjectivities of these institutionalized forms of knowledge suggest that we should move away from the illusionment that purely rational, disembodied, and objective knowledge carries authority over other forms of knowledge, such as those produced by subjective and embodied experiences. Thank you.